The night sky over the vast Dasht-e-Kavir desert was suddenly torn apart by a blinding explosion that illuminated the surrounding dunes with a terrifying orange glow. It was the early hours of April 25, 1980, and a remote location known only as Desert One had transformed from a clandestine rendezvous point into a chaotic inferno. United States service members scrambled desperately across the shifting sands to escape the searing heat of burning aviation fuel that spewed from the wreckage of a collision between a transport plane and a helicopter. The silence of the Iranian wilderness was replaced by the roar of flames and the shouting of men who had trained for months to save lives, but now found themselves fighting to survive a catastrophic accident in the middle of hostile territory. This disaster in the dark signaled the tragic end to a daring military operation that had been designed to solve an impossible diplomatic standoff. The mission was meant to be a surgical strike to extract American citizens trapped deep within a revolutionary capital city, but it ended in death and despair on a lonely salt flat. The burning wreckage at Desert One became a symbol of a nation pushed to its limits and a military force struggling against the unpredictable nature of warfare. As the survivors boarded the remaining aircraft to flee the scene, they left behind 8 of their comrades and the shattered hopes of a presidency. The world would soon wake up to the news of Operation Eagle Claw and its devastating failure. The stakes leading up to this moment could not have been higher for the United States of America or for the 52 hostages held captive in Tehran. Since November of the previous year, these American diplomats and citizens had been imprisoned inside the United States Embassy by student revolutionaries supporting the Ayatollah Khomeini. Every day of their captivity eroded the prestige of the United States and weakened the administration of President Jimmy Carter. The crisis dominated nightly news broadcasts and created a sense of national paralysis that demanded action. With diplomatic channels completely frozen and economic sanctions failing to secure a release, the lives of the hostages hung in a delicate balance, while the patience of the American public began to run out. Facing an election year and a geopolitical nightmare, President Jimmy Carter found himself cornered with few viable options remaining on the table. The pressure to act was immense, but the risks of a military rescue were equally staggering. Tehran was a densely populated city surrounded by mountains and located hundreds of miles from friendly bases or open waters. Any rescue attempt would require a complex synchronization of air, land, and sea forces operating in complete secrecy under the nose of a hostile military. A failure would not only doom the hostages to potential execution, but could also ignite a wider war in the volatile Middle East. Despite the overwhelming odds, President Carter authorized the planning of a rescue mission that would rely on precision and boldness. To lead the ground element of this unprecedented mission, the military turned to a man who had spent his career preparing for exactly this kind of impossible scenario. Colonel Charles Alvin Beckwith was a hardened veteran of the Vietnam War and a visionary who had long advocated for a dedicated counterterrorism unit. Known for his gruff demeanor and uncompromising standards, Colonel Beckwith had founded the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, commonly known as Delta Force. He was a warrior who believed in rigorous training and the absolute necessity of elite special operations capabilities. For Colonel Beckwith, Operation Eagle Claw was not just a mission, but the ultimate test of the unit he had built from the ground up. Colonel Charles Alvin Beckwith had modeled Delta Force after the British Special Air Service, where he had served as an exchange officer years earlier. He understood that conventional tactics would not work in the narrow streets of Tehran or the fortified compound of the embassy. His operators were the best of the best, selected for their physical endurance and mental agility. They trained relentlessly in shooting houses and mock-ups of the embassy compound, rehearsing every breach and every shot. However, even the most elite soldiers are dependent on the machinery that transports them and the logistics that support them. The plan Beckwith helped devise was a masterpiece of complexity, involving multiple branches of the armed forces working in concert. The operational plan for the rescue was an intricate ballet of moving parts that spanned thousands of miles and required absolute timing. It involved launching 8 United States Navy helicopters from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, located in the Arabian Sea. These helicopters would fly under radar cover to a remote spot in the Iranian desert, designated as Desert 1. Simultaneously, several Lockheed C-130 Hercules transport planes carrying fuel and the Delta Force commandos would fly from Oman to meet the helicopters at this rendezvous point. After refueling, the helicopters would carry the soldiers to a hiding spot near Tehran called Desert 2, where they would wait in cover until the following night to assault the embassy. The complexity of the plan was its greatest strength, but also its most dangerous weakness, because every single phase had to go perfectly for the next to succeed. The distance the helicopters had to travel was at the very limit of their operational range, requiring mid-mission refueling on the ground in enemy territory. The planners selected the Sikorsky RH-53DC Stallion helicopters, which were originally designed for minesweeping operations rather than long-range desert transport. These powerful machines were necessary for their heavy lift capacity, but they had a history of maintenance challenges. The pilots were drawn from the Navy and Marine Corps, while the ground force was Army, adding a layer of inter-service coordination that would prove difficult to manage. Training for the mission was intense and conducted in secrecy at various locations across the United States, including the deserts of the Southwest, which mimicked the Iranian terrain. The pilots practiced flying low at night using night vision goggles that were primitive by modern standards. The Delta Force operators honed their assault tactics until they could clear rooms in their sleep. However, the disparate elements of the force rarely trained together as a full unit due to the need for operational security. This compartmentalization meant that the first time all the moving parts would come together fully would be on the actual night of the mission deep inside Iran. It was a gamble that relied heavily on the professionalism of every individual involved. As the launch date approached, intelligence reports indicated that the hostages were still being held at the embassy compound, making a rescue feasible. However, the political clock was ticking, and the window of opportunity was closing as the nights grew shorter with the approaching summer. President Jimmy Carter gave the final approval for the mission to proceed on April 24, 1980. The task force assembled in the region ready to execute a plan that many military analysts would later describe as one of the most daring in history. The men were ready and their equipment was checked, but no amount of planning could account for the unpredictable weather patterns of the Iranian desert. On the fateful evening, the C-130 Hercules transport planes roared down the runway in Oman and lifted into the darkening sky carrying Colonel Beckwith and his Delta Force troopers. They flew low over the waters of the Persian Gulf to avoid radar detection before crossing the coast into Iran. Inside the cavernous cargo holds, the soldiers sat in silence, checking their weapons and mentally preparing for the violence that awaited them in Tehran. The flight to Desert 1 was long and uncomfortable, but the transport planes were reliable workhorses that navigated the route without significant issues. Their arrival at the landing zone marked the successful beginning of the first phase of the operation. Meanwhile, on the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, the 8 RH-53DC Stallion helicopters spun up their massive rotors, creating a deafening roar. The Marine Corps pilots lifted the heavy aircraft into the humid air of the Arabian Sea and turned north toward the Iranian coast. They were flying under strict radio silence to maintain the element of surprise. The plan required a minimum of 6 helicopters to reach Desert 1 to ensure there was enough lift capacity for the hostages and troops during the extraction. They launched with 8, giving them a buffer of 2 spare aircraft for mechanical failures. They would need every bit of that buffer before the night was over. Trouble began for the helicopter formation almost as soon as they crossed into Iranian airspace. Approximately 2 hours into the flight, the crew of helicopter number 6 received a warning light indicating a potential failure in a rotor blade. The pilot made the difficult decision to set the aircraft down in the desert to inspect the issue. Upon verification of the malfunction, the crew abandoned the helicopter and were picked up by another helicopter in the formation. This early loss reduced the force to 7 helicopters, erasing half of their margin for error before they had even reached the halfway point. The remaining pilots pressed on, unaware that the worst was yet to come. As the formation continued deeper into Iran, they encountered a phenomenon known as a haboob, which is a massive wall of suspended dust. The meteorological reports had not predicted this severe weather condition, and the pilots were caught completely off guard. The fine dust swirled around the aircraft, reducing visibility to near zero and creating a disorienting environment that tested their flying skills to the limit. Flying with night vision goggles in a dust storm was a nightmare as the particles scattered the ambient light and obscured the horizon. The formation broke apart as each pilot fought a solitary battle against the blinding dust, trying to maintain a low altitude to avoid radar while not crashing into the terrain. The psychological strain on the helicopter pilots was immense as they flew hour after hour in the suffocating dust cloud. The high internal temperatures of the helicopters, combined with the intense concentration required to keep the aircraft stable, caused severe fatigue. During this chaotic flight, helicopter number 5 experienced a failure of its primary flight instruments. Without visual references or reliable instruments, the pilot determined that it was unsafe to continue the mission. Unaware that the formation was already down to 7 aircraft, the pilot of number 5 turned back toward the USS Nimitz. This decision reduced the helicopter force to 6, which was the absolute minimum required to complete the mission. While the helicopters struggled through the dust, the C-130 transport planes had successfully landed at Desert 1. The site was a flat stretch of hard, packed sand near a remote road that was supposed to be deserted at that hour. Colonel Beckwith and his men established a perimeter and set up the refueling equipment, waiting for the helicopters to arrive. The timeline was already slipping, and anxiety began to build as the radio silence kept them uninformed about the plight of the helicopter force. The remote desert location felt exposed, and every minute spent on the ground increased the risk of discovery by Iranian patrols or civilians. The assumption that the road would be empty proved to be dangerously incorrect almost immediately after the ground force arrived. A bus carrying Iranian civilians suddenly appeared out of the darkness, driving straight toward the secret American landing zone. The Delta Force operators had no choice but to stop the vehicle and detain the bewildered passengers to prevent them from raising the alarm. Moments later, a fuel tanker truck approached the site, and when it refused to stop, the soldiers fired a light anti-tank weapon to disable it. The truck exploded into a massive fireball that lit up the desert night like a beacon, potentially alerting anyone for miles around. The burning fuel truck created a surreal and hellish backdrop as the Delta Force operators guarded the detained bus passengers and scanned the sky for the delayed helicopters. The operation, which relied on stealth, was now illuminated by a raging fire that could not be extinguished. Colonel Beckwith paced the landing zone, checking his watch and worrying about the delay. The mission was already unraveling, and the friction of war was evident in every unplanned event. Finally, the sound of rotor blades cut through the night air as the first of the straggling sea stallions emerged from the darkness and landed at Desert 1. The helicopters arrived one by one, appearing like exhausted birds after their battle with the dust storm. The pilots were physically drained and shaken by the harrowing flight. As they shut down their engines or taxied into position for refueling, the magnitude of their journey became clear. They were late, and the window of darkness required to reach the next hiding spot was shrinking rapidly. The ground crews rushed to connect fuel hoses, dragging heavy lines across the sand to the thirsty helicopters. Colonel Beckwith conferred with the pilots, trying to get a clear picture of the force strength. It was during this critical consolidation phase that the mission received its fatal blow. As the crews assessed the condition of the 6 remaining helicopters, the pilot of helicopter number 2 reported a severe hydraulic malfunction. The secondary hydraulic system had failed, and the pump was seizing up, making the aircraft unsafe to fly with a heavy load. The pilot refused to fly the crippled machine any further. This mechanical failure meant that there were now only 5 operational helicopters available for the mission. The mathematical reality was brutal and inescapable, because the plan absolutely required 6 helicopters to lift the assault team and the hostages. Colonel Charles Alvin Beckwith stood on the desert floor, facing the toughest decision of his military career. He conferred with his commanders, and the senior pilot confirming that there was no way to proceed with only 5 helicopters. The risk of losing another helicopter during the assault or extraction was too high, and they would not have enough seats to get everyone out of Tehran. With a heavy heart and a surge of frustration, Colonel Beckwith contacted the command center via satellite radio. He uttered the words that no commander wants to say, recommending that the mission be aborted. The order was relayed to the White House, where a devastated President Carter gave the permission to withdraw. The order to abort the mission replaced the tension of the assault with the bitter disappointment of failure. The objective now shifted from rescuing hostages to extracting the military force safely from Iran. The plan was for the helicopters to refuel from the C-130 tankers and then fly back to the USS Nimitz, while the Delta Force troops would board the transport planes and return to Oman. The exhaustion of the pilots and the ground crews was palpable as they began the reconfiguration for departure. The desert was dark again except for the dim lights of the aircraft, and the soldiers moved with the heavy lethargy of letdown. In the cramped and dusty environment of Desert 1, the aircraft had to maneuver carefully to reposition for refueling and departure. One of the RH-53D helicopters needed to move to a new position to allow a C-130 to taxi for takeoff. The helicopter pilot lifted his machine into a hover, kicking up a blinding cloud of sand that engulfed the area. The rotor wash was intense, and the visibility dropped instantly. The tired pilot, relying on the hand signals of a ground guide he could barely see, struggled to control the drifting aircraft in the swirling dust. Tragedy struck in a split second as the main rotor blade of the hovering helicopter sliced into the vertical stabilizer of the waiting C-130 transport plane. The impact was catastrophic and immediate. The fuel-laden helicopter crashed down onto the wing of the fully fueled transport plane, igniting a massive explosion. Thousands of gallons of aviation fuel detonated, instantly creating a fireball that consumed both aircraft. The force of the blast knocked men to the ground and sent shrapnel flying across the landing zone. The peaceful extraction had turned into a deadly nightmare. Inside the burning C-130, the crew and soldiers faced a desperate struggle to escape the inferno. Flames roared through the fuselage and thick toxic smoke filled the cargo hold. Men scrambled for the side exits and the rear ramp, helping each other blindly through the chaos. On the helicopter, the crew had no chance as the intense heat consumed the airframe. Ammunition stored on the aircraft began to cook off, popping and exploding, adding to the terror of the moment. The survivors on the ground watched in horror as their friends were engulfed by the fire, unable to get close enough to help due to the intense heat. When the initial explosions subsided, the cost of the accident became painfully clear. 8 American service members had lost their lives in the fire. 5 were Air Force personnel from the C-130 crew, and 3 were Marines from the helicopter crew. Several others were severely burned or injured. The remaining force was in shock, stunned by the sudden violence of the accident. Colonel Beckwith rallied his men, focusing them on the immediate need to evacuate the wounded and the survivors before the sun rose or the Iranian military arrived. The decision was made to abandon the remaining helicopters at Desert 1, as there was no time to destroy them or fly them out. The surviving crews and the Delta Force operators boarded the remaining C-130 transport planes, which were undamaged. They had to leave the bodies of the 8 fallen men behind in the burning wreckage, a decision that tormented every man who boarded those planes. It was a violation of the warrior ethos to leave no man behind, but the safety of the living took precedence in the dire circumstances. The transport planes taxied around the burning debris and lifted off into the night, leaving the dead and the secret documents inside the helicopters on the desert floor. The flight back to Oman was a somber journey filled with silence and grief. The men who had launched with high hopes of heroism were returning with nothing but the ash of failure and the loss of their brothers. Colonel Beckwith sat in the cargo hold, contemplating the disaster and the impact it would have. The mission that was supposed to restore American pride had instead resulted in a humiliating retreat. As the sun rose over the Middle East, the wreckage at Desert One continued to smolder, a testament to the cruelty of Murphy's Law and the high price of special operations. Back in Washington, District of Columbia, the news of the disaster reached the White House Situation Room. President Jimmy Carter was reportedly heartbroken by the loss of life and the failure of the mission. He faced the difficult task of addressing the nation to explain what had happened. At 7 in the morning on April 25th, President Carter appeared on national television to announce the rescue attempt and its tragic conclusion. He took full responsibility for the failure, demonstrating a level of accountability that was both praised and pitied by the public. The reaction in Iran was one of jubilation and propaganda. The Iranian government displayed the charred bodies of the American servicemen and the wreckage of the aircraft to the world press. These gruesome images were broadcast globally, further humiliating the United States and deepening the anger of the American people. The Iranians also recovered sensitive documents left in the abandoned helicopters, which compromised agents and details of the Central Intelligence Agency networks in the region. The failure at Desert One seemed to validate the revolutionary rhetoric of the Ayatollah, who claimed that divine intervention had protected Iran. For the families of the 8 men who died, the news was a devastating blow. They had not known their loved ones were on such a dangerous mission until the public announcement. The nation mourned the loss of these volunteers who had risked everything to save their fellow citizens. Memorial services were held and the bravery of the fallen was honored, but the cloud of failure hung heavy over their sacrifice. The question of why the mission failed and who was to blame began to circulate in the media and the halls of Congress. The military immediately launched an investigation to understand the causes of the disaster. The Holloway Commission, led by Admiral James Holloway III, conducted a thorough review of the operation. The commission identified numerous flaws, including the lack of a unified command structure, the incompatibility of equipment, and the insufficient joint training between the service branches. The report highlighted that while the individual service members were highly skilled, the system they operated in was fractured and ill-suited for such a complex joint mission. One of the most significant findings was the issue of the helicopters. The report concluded that the number of helicopters was insufficient for the attrition rate experienced in such harsh conditions. It also criticized the decision to rely on ad hoc planning cells rather than an established joint task force. The failure of Operation Eagle Claw exposed the inability of the United States military to effectively conduct joint special operations. This realization would spark a massive transformation in how the military was organized and how it approached counterterrorism. The direct result of the lessons learned at Desert One was the creation of the United States Special Operations Command, or USSOCOM. This new unified combatant command was established to oversee all special operations forces from the Army, Navy, and Air Force, ensuring they trained together and used compatible equipment. The tragedy also led to the formation of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers, dedicated specifically to flying special operations missions. The modern capability of the United States to conduct precision raids anywhere in the world was born from the ashes of Desert One. For President Jimmy Carter, the failure of Operation Eagle Claw was the final nail in the coffin of his presidency. His inability to secure the release of the hostages, combined with the military disaster, eroded public confidence in his leadership. In the election of November 1980, he was defeated by Ronald Reagan in a landslide. Ironically, the hostages were released on January 20, 1980, 1 mere minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, ending their 444 days of captivity. The legacy of Operation Eagle Claw is a complex mix of tragedy and transformation. It serves as a somber reminder of the risks inherent in military operations and the devastating consequences of mechanical and human failure. However, it also stands as a pivotal moment that forced the United States military to evolve. The special operations community that exists today, with its unparalleled integration and capability, owes its structure to the hard lessons learned on that dark night in the Iranian desert. The 8 men who died at Desert One did not die in vain, for their sacrifice paved the way for the future success of American Special Forces. Today, the site of the disaster in the Dasht-e-Kavir Desert is quiet, reclaimed by the shifting sands and the wind. But in the history of the United States military, Desert One remains a hallowed name. It represents the courage of those who dared to try the impossible and the humility required to learn from defeat. The rescue attempt was a tragic failure in its execution, but a noble endeavor in its intent. It remains a whisper of time that echoes through the generations, reminding us that even the best laid plans can falter, but the spirit of those who serve remains unbroken.